Today we're going to talk about the secondary missions from Games Workshop's Eternal War and Grand Tournament packs. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now with the advent of 9th edition, the Eternal War missions take a little bit more thought than before, I think. As well as the fairly simple primary objectives of holding certain objectives more so than your opponent, we now also need to try and select and achieve 3 different secondary objectives, and I think there's going to be a decent amount of skill in picking the right ones, as it could really make your game a lot easier or a lot harder. So the way that scoring objectives at the moment works is that you get up to 45 points for primary mission objectives, generally things like holding a certain amount of objectives or maybe holding more than your opponent on various different turns. You get up to 45 points for secondary objectives, and you get 10 points for having your battle ready painted army. These secondary objectives are a bit of a mini game within the main game of destroying your opponent's army and capturing those objectives. You select 3 missions out of the 5 different secondary categories, and you can only select 1 from each category. Missions also tend to have their own secondary objectives in the mission itself, and these ones can be picked instead if it makes more sense for your army. You get to pick them after seeing your opponent's army, which means that you can make decisions on them to sort of counter your opponent's list. At the most basic level, if your opponent has lots of one type of unit, then there's various secondaries that can reward you for destroying certain unit types. You can also judge things though by whether or not they're going to be able to take and hold the centre of the board, or whether or not they're going to have enough board control to secure more objectives than you. Each secondary objective you can score up to 15 points on and not more. If you keep on scoring points of that secondary objective, then you don't get any more for it. Though a lot of the secondary objectives aren't particularly easy to score these 15 points on. I think unless one army is absolutely dominating the other one, then you're going to be quite unlikely to score a full 45 points for all of your secondaries. In general tactics for picking, you should absolutely be tailoring them to the mission that you're playing and your opponent's list. Have a bit of a plan of how the game's going to go and whether or not you think that the secondary objectives will be easy to achieve while also giving you victory overall when the primaries are accounted for. I would also bear in mind that if you pick certain objectives, your opponent could well try and stop you achieving those. Say if you picked the one for assassinate to kill characters, then it would be in their interest to keep their characters extra safe all game and deny you the points for that secondary, so there's a bit of an interplay there. Finally, and sort of unhelpfully, there are slight differences between the Eternal War mission secondary objectives and the ones from the Grand Tournament mission pack in Chapter Approved. They're only quite small differences, but they are quite meaningful for some objectives and might decide whether or not you take them. For the rest of the video, we'll just run through the 5 different categories of secondaries and talk about which ones I think are strongest and weakest. First up, we have Purge the Enemy, which is basically about killing things. In general, these are the ones that are quite easy to pick if your opponent either has a lot of Titanic units, has a lot of characters, or has a lot of vehicles or monsters. Titan Slayers will get you 10 victory points for killing 1 Titanic unit, or the full 15 victory points for taking 2. In general, if you're facing an army with 3+ Titanic units, then this is a really easy pick, as it's kind of perfectly aligned with what you want to do. And to be honest, even if you only kill 1, then you're still getting quite a lot of points towards your secondary. It's slightly different in the GT pack. You get 10 points for killing 1, 12 points for killing 2, or 15 points for killing 3. So it is going to be a fairly easy one to get 10 points on, even if you don't get more. Next we have Assassinate, which is 3 victory points for each character killed, and in general if your opponent's army is character heavy then it makes a lot of sense to take this one. If they have somewhere around 5 characters, there's a good chance you'll be getting quite a lot of points out of this one, and if they have more than this then it becomes even more viable. Obviously it's even better if you have your own decent snipers in your army. Next we have Bring It Down, which I think will be taken quite a lot. Basically you get 2 victory points for killing each vehicle or monster, and if it's got 11 wounds or more, then you get 3 victory points instead. If you're facing any sort of armoured column with a whole load of vehicles, again this is a really easy pick. If you can envisage by the end of the game having killed a decent amount of them, then you're pretty guaranteed to score very highly on the secondary. Finally we have Slay the Warlord, which in the Eternal War mission pack is just 6 victory points for killing the enemy warlord. Honestly, it's not the highest reward ever, even if it's not the hardest thing to do, and I typically not want to take it compared with the others, apart from in really specific situations. It might honestly be a bit easier in smaller games, say if you're playing Combat Patrol or something. The GT mission pack makes it a bit more interesting though. Basically you get more points for killing the warlord earlier in the game, you get 6 victory points if you kill them in turn 3, more if you kill them before that, and less if you kill it after that. It could again be a fairly easy one to score, particularly if your opponent can't hide their warlord, say they're a big Imperial Knight or Mortarion or something, and you might be fairly confident that you might be able to take it down turn 1 or turn 2 with focused fire. Overall though, I think that Titan Slayers, Assassinate and Bring It Down are all excellent secondaries, but it is going to depend on exactly what your opponent is bringing to the table. Next up we have Battlefield Supremacy, and we've got 3 here. Firstly we have Engage on All Fronts, which is a table quarters objective, and you basically get points for your units standing in table quarters and not within 6 inches of the centre. If at the end of your turn you have units in 3 different table quarters, you get 2 victory points, and if you have them in all 4 you get 3. If you've got lots of small mobile units, then this should be really quite easy to score some points on, but I don't think it's very easy to max at all, as you would have to have units in 4 table quarters every single turn in a 5-turn game. It might be hard to get them out turn 1, and you might have lost a significant chunk of your army by turn 5, so I would say that this one's a little bit more niche personally. Linebreaker is quite an interesting one in a bit of a similar theme. You get 4 victory points if at the end of your turn 2 or more units are wholly within the enemy deployment zone, so it's harder to get your units over there, but the rewards are a fair bit higher than Engage on All Fronts, and this one's a bit more mathematically easy to max, as you only have to achieve it 4 turns rather than 5, and you only need 2 of your units per turn to achieve this. Again, for fast aggressive armies, say just stereotypically things like Dark Eldar Venom spam, this really wouldn't be all that hard to achieve, or if you're just playing a very aggressive melee type army, something like Blood Angels, you're quite likely to be throwing infantry and characters into the enemy drop zone, so you might easily be scoring this purely by doing what you were going to do anyway. Finally we have Domination, which is sort of doubling down on securing the objectives. Again, it's scored at the end of your turn, and you need to control over half the number of total objectives. This isn't a bad one if you have really strong board control. Say if you've got a big durable mass of troops, you're pretty much guaranteed to be holding your own ones, and you might be able to push up to the ones in the middle. Again, not the easiest to max, as you would have to do this every single turn, but again potentially not one that's very easy for your opponent to stop you getting at least a fair few points with if you have one of these armies. Overall, for fast armies that can do things like this, I feel that Linebreaker might be slightly stronger than Engage on All Fronts for most armies, though it does sort of depend on exactly what you're fighting and whether or not your opponent has really good drop zone control. Next up we have No Mercy, No Respite, which in general is about killing things, though there's one for your units to try and survive a bit longer as well. Firstly we have Thin Their Ranks, which gives you a kill tally, where you add 1 to it for every enemy model destroyed, or if that model had 10 wounds or more, then you add 10 to it instead. At the end of the game you divide by 10 and round down, and that's how many victory points that you score, up to your maximum of 15. For me this one's really quite an easy calculation to make at the start of the game. You can basically see how many models you will have the opportunity of killing throughout the game, and you're basically sort of gambling on whether or not you're going to be able to kill that many. Say whether or not you think you might be tabling your opponent. If you think that your army is going to win the fight in terms of killing each other, then I really don't think it's that bad a pick, to be honest. But I think it's going to be a lot more viable if you're playing against armies that have more horde type units, or perhaps just a lot of light armour with 10 wounds or more. I think taking this against armies such as Imperial Guard could really be quite strong. It might allow you to kind of double down on getting more victory points for every big tank that you destroy, and you can fill up the rest with infantry. Next is Attrition, which you score whenever you kill more enemy units than you lost in units over the course of a battle round. You get 4 victory points in the standard Eternal War mission pack, but it's changed to 3 victory points in the Grand Tournament mission pack. Basically this is going to be good if you're playing an army with just a few major units versus another army that has lots of small units. Say for example if you were playing Imperial Knights against something with lots and lots of small scattered ones, you could be honestly nearly guaranteed to do this every single turn. If the game does wind down before turn 5 though, either you get tabled or your opponent does, then it will mean that you won't be able to finish scoring this though. Next we have quite an interesting one in While We Fight We Stand. This one makes you pick your 3 most expensive models points wise, and you have to try and keep them alive till the end of the game. For each one that you do manage to keep alive, then you get 5 victory points. I think that this one's really quite interesting and could be worth taking in quite a lot of scenarios. It just really depends on your list as to how hard it's going to be to kill these big expensive units, and how aggressive you think you're going to need to be with them. I think that this one could be particularly powerful if you had some really fighty characters behind a tough gun line. If those characters happen to be your most points intensive units, then it could be really hard for your opponent to remove them. Models like Guilliman or Belisarius Core are pretty prime examples for this. It might just make things a little bit more difficult for you, as it will make you want to play a bit more cagey with these powerful models, and you might need them just to win the game as a whole. It could also be good against enemy armies as well that are trying to win the game just through board control and don't really have all that much damage output. If you think there's a good chance that your biggest and most armoured units will survive till the end of the game, then it's a pretty reasonable one to pick up. Finally we have First Strike, which is quite a low scoring one. You get 5 victory points for destroying an enemy unit in the first battle round, or 3 victory points if you killed more units in the first battle round than the enemy. I don't really like this one, to be honest. It only scores you a maximum of 8 victory points, and I think in general you'll be able to get better than that. It's also completely absent from the Grand Tournament mission pack, so you can't take it at all if you are playing that. Moving on, we have shadow operations, and these are the ones that make your units stand around doing actions to trade for victory points. The first one is investigate sites, where you have to have a non-character infantry model within 6 inches of the centre of the board, and there can't be any enemies within 6 inches either. Each time your infantry unit completes this action, and it's done by the end of your turn, then you get 3 victory points. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this one. I think it's really quite easy to counter by your opponent putting units in the centre of the board, and for every turn they stop you doing this, you'll never be able to get those points again, as you can only get 15 max from this. Honestly, I don't think that this one's going to be one of the stronger ones. Next we have Repair Teleport Homer, which is your characters or infantry doing an action in the enemy deployment zone, and you get 5 victory points for each time they can do it. Basically this unit will start doing the action. Obviously they won't be able to do anything the same turn, but this time the action isn't completed to your next command phase, so basically your opponent has the opportunity to be able to shoot down or kill your unit. On top of this, it gets you a bit less than the GT mission pack, and you only get 4 points there. Personally, again, I'm not the biggest fan of this one, though it could be quite useful if you're playing both an enemy army that doesn't have good board control and also isn't particularly lethal in terms of killing things. Potentially could be a reasonable one to pick up some points at the end of the game if you think you can beat your way past the enemy army and then perhaps have a turn or two of scoring objectives. Still though, I can't necessarily say that this is my favourite. I just don't like the way that your opponent can shoot the unit that's doing the action dead. Next we have Raise the Banners High. This one takes an action for each of your infantry units on a different objective. Doing that action will put a banner on the objective that you control, and from then on your banner will generate you 1 victory point in each of your command phases and at the end of the game. If your opponent takes control of the objective for any phase, then the banner is removed. In general, I do think that this one's really quite a powerful one, to be honest. It means that if you can plonk those banners down on 3 different objectives towards the start of the game, if your opponent can't remove them, then each one of those banners will be worth 5 victory points over the course of the game. If you've got some really solid board control and you think you're going to be able to hold those objectives, then this one could be a very hard objective for your opponents to do anything about. Perhaps one downside is having your troops have to sit around and do actions on the first turn rather than do anything useful, but it's really not the worst thing in the world if you have a few units of chaff about. It's definitely far better on the missions with more objectives and ones that you can access very early, but I do think that this one could be very strong. Finally, there's one that's just in the Grand Tournament pack and isn't in the normal Eternal War missions. This one's Deploy Scramblers. And this one you have to do 3 different actions with 3 different infantry units, once within your own deployment zone, once that's 6 inches away from both players' deployment zone, and once in your opponent's deployment zone. If you manage to do those 3 actions, then you get 10 victory points. I think that this one's a touch weird, to be honest. It's really quite easy to achieve, but you can only ever get a maximum of 10 victory points. Maybe if you're struggling for a last secondary, and you just want something that's going to be relatively easy to do, and presuming you're planning to be able to get something in your opponent's deployment zone at some point in the game. Overall, my favourite for shadow operations is Raise the Banners. Obviously it depends on the army that you're playing though. I'm not saying that the others couldn't be good, but I think that they're a little bit more counterable if you are facing a strong opponent. Finally, we get on to Warpcraft. There's 3 from Eternal War, and there's another extra one in the Grand Tournament pack. Firstly, and possibly one of the strongest objectives out of any of them, is Abhor the Witch. This is basically your anti-psyker one that you almost auto-take if you're playing Thousand Suns or Grey Knights. Basically you get 5 victory points for each psyker character that you kill, or 3 victory points for any other psyker unit that you kill as well. Seeing as near enough the entire Great Knight army is psykers, and the Thousand Suns also have others of their own with the Rubric Marines, then it's really quite a good one to take. It stacks very painfully with the Assassinate Characters one, which means that you could be potentially getting 8 victory points each time you kill a psychic character. Next up we have Mental Interrogation. This is one where you cast a psychic power as a psychic action, and you have to do it within 18 inches of an enemy character. You get 3 victory points each time you manage to do so. If you have a psyker that you can afford to sacrifice their psychic powers of all game, then it could be a fairly easy one to get a fair few points from, though I would beware some denials if your opponent has a lot of psykers about themselves. Next we have a Psychic Ritual, and this one's a Warp Charge 3 psychic action that you have to be within 6 inches of the centre of the board to do. Basically you have to have one model do this action 3 times over the course of the game, and if you manage to do so then you get the full 15 victory points. I feel like this one's pretty high risk, high reward. If you can get your psyker to be able to do this, then obviously it's great. But obviously your opponent will be doing their absolute best to either kill that psyker or deny the casts of the ritual. I think you'd have to be fairly confident with your board control and your ability to keep that psyker alive to even think about taking this one. Finally, there's a pretty unusual one called Pierce the Veil, which is only in the Grand Tournament pack. This one's a funny sort of psychic action where you have to cast on a Warp Charge 4, and strangely enough you have to be within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge, and also outside 6 inches of any enemy models. If you can cast it twice then you get 8 victory points, and if you cast it 4 times somehow then you get 15 victory points. To be honest, I think it's going to be a rare game that you're going to be able to cast this 4 times, unless you do something very strange such as Zuma Farseer all the way over to the other side of the board, and then keep on casting straight from turn 1 or turn 2, and somehow your opponent doesn't manage to kill that unit all game long. And even if you do this, then you've sort of given up a pretty big opportunity cost to do so. If you do have a Psyker in the opponent's deployment zone, then using the powers to just damage their army and win you the game overall might be the better option anyway. So in general from Warpcraft, I think that Abhor the Witch is the strongest, though obviously situational depending on what you're fighting. And for the actual psychic armies themselves, then Mental Interrogation and Psychic Ritual I think are both strong, though Mental Interrogation is a bit more reliable and Psychic Ritual is very much all or nothing. So overall for secondary objectives, I think that most people will generally be switching them up a bit game on game. For Purge the Enemy, I like Titan Slayers, Assassinate and Bring It Down. For No Mercy, No Respite, then their ranks, Attrition and While We Stand We Fight are all decently usable. For Battlefield Supremacy, I think that you'll typically be able to score some victory points on these but not usually max them. And if you are playing a hypermobile army, then I'd be most tempted by Linebreaker. For Shadow Operations, I really like Raise the Banners if there are a lot of objectives in play, and you do think that you have the board control to keep them going all game long. And for Warpcraft, Abhor the Witch is pretty much an auto take against certain armies, and Mental Interrogation and Ritual are also possible if you have Psykers. It'll certainly be interesting to see what people do with these, and whether or not they build armies around either denying them, or trying to deny them, or make them hard to score for your opponent. I'm quite looking forward to seeing how this impacts list building. If you have any other thoughts or insights on the secondary objectives, please let me know down in the comments below. This is all still very much up in the air as to what's going to be the best thing or not. I think far more game experience is needed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly be keeping the 40k Tactics content coming as the edition unfolds. And if you have been enjoying my content recently, I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which is how I can spend quite so much time making videos about Warhammer Tactics. If you would like to help keep the content coming, then the link is down in the video description below. Channel patrons also get access to certain other things, such as seeing videos early, voting on what comes next, and entry to prize draws. Feel free to check that all out if you'd like to. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.